Encircled and freezing in Ardennes, the 101st Airborne Division found itself cut off from American lines in December 1944, when German counteroffensive through Belgium created salient that surrounded Bastogne and isolated American forces, defending critical road junction that controlled access to Belgian interior. They're outgunned by elite German armoured divisions, including veteran SS Panzer units, whose tanks and artillery overwhelmed American defensive positions that lacked adequate anti-tank weapons or artillery support to counter German firepower advantage. Surrounded by German forces that had achieved tactical surprise through attacking in bad weather that grounded Allied air power, American paratroopers defending Bastogne faced prospect of annihilation or surrender as German forces tightened encirclement and demanded American capitulation. No supplies reached besieged garrison after German advance cut road and rail connections, leaving defenders dependent on whatever ammunition, food, and medical supplies they possessed when encirclement closed around town, whose defense was essential for disrupting German offensive timetable. No reinforcements could reach Bastogne through German lines that blocked all approach routes, making defenders aware that survival depended entirely on their ability to hold positions until relief force could break through German encirclement from outside. No hope seemed justified by tactical situation where surrounded American forces faced superior German numbers and firepower without prospect of resupply or reinforcement, making surrender appear rational alternative to continued resistance that would merely delay inevitable defeat. The 101st's situation in Bastogne represented worst-case scenario for military unit, isolated, outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by enemy forces whose commander expected quick American surrender once defenders recognized hopelessness of their tactical position. Freezing weather added physical suffering to tactical desperation, as inadequately clothed American soldiers endured Belgian winter without sufficient cold weather gear, making frostbite and hypothermia casualties that weakened defensive capacity as surely as German artillery and infantry assaults did through direct combat. Nuts became immortal one-word response when American Commander McAuliffe replied to German surrender demand with contemptuous rejection that demonstrated American determination to resist despite hopeless tactical situation. Holding line against impossible odds required grit that sustained soldiers through days of German assaults testing American defensive perimeter, improvisation that stretched limited supplies and ammunition through careful rationing and creative tactical solutions, and sheer refusal to quit despite circumstances that justified surrender by any reasonable military calculation. Through determination that German commanders had not anticipated from surrounded American forces expected to recognize futility of continued resistance, defenders maintained cohesive defense despite German attacks that penetrated American lines temporarily before being driven back by counterattacks. They hold town long enough for Patton's relief force to break through German encirclement on December 26th, linking up with exhausted defenders who had prevented German forces from capturing road junction essential for sustaining offensive momentum toward Meuse River. A suicidal stand becomes legendary victory, as Bastogne's defense demonstrated that American forces could withstand German military pressure when defending positions they refused to abandon regardless of tactical disadvantages, transforming what should have been quick German victory into costly failure that consumed time and resources German offensive could not afford to waste. The defense bought crucial days that allowed Allied forces to organize counter-offensive that would drive German forces back and eliminate bulge salient that Hitler's gamble had temporarily created. Legendary status came from defenders' refusal to accept surrender that tactical situation seemed to demand, their determination inspiring subsequent generations as example of how courage and stubbornness could overcome material disadvantages when soldiers believed their mission justified extreme sacrifices. Bastogne proved that surrounded forces could survive through defensive skill and determination when relief was possible, vindicating American decision to hold rather than surrendering town, whose loss would have opened routes for German advance deeper into Belgium, towards strategic objectives that Bastogne's continued resistance denied them permanently. A barely armed regiment on edge of collapse was 20th Maine Infantry, positioned on Little Round Top slopes at Gettysburg on July 2, 1863, defending extreme left flank of Union line against repeated Confederate assaults, attempting to turn Union position by capturing undefended hill, whose loss would have compromised entire Union defensive position. They faced Confederate attacks with dwindling ammunition that couldn't be resupplied during battle, because supply wagons were positioned too far behind lines to reach regiment under fire, leaving soldiers counting remaining cartridges and recognizing that continued resistance would soon become impossible once ammunition was completely exhausted. Exhausted men who had marched constantly before reaching Gettysburg struggled to maintain defensive positions against fresh Confederate troops, whose aggressive assaults tested Union line repeatedly throughout afternoon. The regiment's position on rocky hillside provided some defensive advantages through terrain that channeled Confederate attacks and through boulders offering cover, but Confederate numerical superiority and determination to break Union flank made defensive situation increasingly desperate as ammunition dwindled and casualties mounted. Repeated Confederate assaults came closer to breaking Union line with each attack, as defenders' ammunition decreased and as fatigue made maintaining defensive fire increasingly difficult for soldiers who had been fighting for hours, without rest or resupply. The 20th Maine's Commander Chamberlain recognized that one more Confederate assault would probably overwhelm his position once remaining ammunition was exhausted, forcing him to choose between ordering retreat that would expose Union flank or attempting desperate counterattack with bayonets against Confederate forces preparing for final assault. Barely armed because most soldiers had fired their last cartridges, regiment faced prospect of hand-to-hand combat against Confederate troops who still possessed loaded weapons and who outnumbered exhausted defenders struggling to hold positions they had defended throughout afternoon. On edge of collapse from casualties, exhaustion, and ammunition shortage that made continued defensive resistance impossible, 20th Maine needed desperate solution that conventional military tactics could not provide for situation where all normal defensive options had been exhausted along with ammunition supply. The bayonet charge that should have failed began when Chamberlain ordered downhill assault with fixed bayonets against Confederate forces who were preparing their own assault on Union position, transforming defensive posture into offensive action that surprised Confederates expecting Union retreat or surrender once defenders' ammunition was exhausted. With no ammo left to maintain defensive fire, Chamberlain recognized that passive defense meant inevitable Confederate breakthrough once next assault came, making aggressive counterattack only remaining option, despite seeming insane to order exhausted men to charge downhill toward enemy who still possessed loaded weapons. They charged downhill in bayonet assault that caught Confederates unprepared for Union aggression at moment when they expected Union collapse, the psychological shock of sudden Union charge disrupting Confederate formations and causing many Confederate soldiers to surrender or flee rather than engaging in hand-to-hand combat with desperate Union soldiers charging with fixed bayonets. The downhill momentum gave Union charge physical advantage that compensated for Confederate numerical superiority, allowing exhausted Union soldiers to drive through Confederate lines through speed and surprise rather than through firepower they no longer possessed. An insane move saves Union flank by preventing Confederate breakthrough that would have compromised entire Union defensive position at Gettysburg, demonstrating that desperate tactical gambles sometimes succeeded when conventional defensive tactics had been exhausted and when commanders possessed courage to attempt operations that military textbooks would have condemned as suicidal. Saves entire battle by preserving Union defensive lines' integrity at moment when Confederate breakthrough on Union left would have forced Union retreat from Cemetery Ridge positions that anchored defensive line for remainder of battle. The charge's success resulted from combination of surprise, momentum, and Confederate demoralization at seeing Union forces attacking when Confederates expected Union surrender, demonstrating that psychological factors could overcome material advantages when circumstances created opportunities for bold action. Chamberlain's bayonet charge became a legendary example of how desperate courage could snatch victory from seemingly certain defeat, inspiring subsequent generations with story of regiment that refused to surrender despite impossible circumstances, and that saved Union Army through audacious counterattack that defied all tactical logic except logic of desperate men with nothing left to lose. Outnumbered, outclassed, and outdated described American naval aviation forces facing Japanese fleet at Midway in June 1942, when American carriers launched strikes against Japanese invasion force despite possessing obsolete aircraft inferior to Japanese planes in speed, maneuverability, and armament. American pilots fly planes like Devastator torpedo bombers that were slow and vulnerable to Japanese fighters, whose poor performance characteristics made them death traps when attacking heavily, defended Japanese carriers protected by experienced fighter pilots flying superior Zeros. Poor training affected many American pilots, who had received minimal preparation before being thrust into combat against Japanese aviators, whose experience in China and Philippines had made them among world's most skilled naval pilots. Broken radios prevented coordination between American strike groups, causing attacks to arrive piecemeal rather than simultaneously as planned, giving Japanese defenders opportunity to intercept each American wave separately rather than being overwhelmed by coordinated assault from multiple directions. Near-certain death faced American torpedo bomber squadrons, whose attacks on Japanese carriers resulted in catastrophic losses as Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed most attacking aircraft without any American torpedoes successfully hitting targets. The Devastator squadrons were virtually annihilated in attacks that accomplished nothing except drawing Japanese fighters down to low altitude where they engaged torpedo bombers, creating opportunity that American dive bombers would exploit minutes later through pure chance rather than through coordinated planning. Against world's most powerful fleet that had dominated Pacific for 6 months since Pearl Harbor, American forces at Midway appeared hopelessly outmatched by Japanese naval aviation, whose superiority had been demonstrated repeatedly in battles from Hawaii to Indian Ocean. Outdated American aircraft, inadequate pilot training, and communication failures that prevented coordination suggested that American attack on Japanese carriers would fail catastrophically, as torpedo bomber attacks had demonstrated through near-complete destruction without achieving any significant damage to Japanese fleet that remained capable of launching devastating counterstrikes against American carriers. The miracle 5 minutes occurred when American dive bombers arrived over Japanese carriers at a moment when Japanese fighters were at low altitude after destroying American torpedo bomber squadrons, leaving Japanese carriers undefended against dive bomber attack that caught 4 carriers with armed and fueled aircraft on decks preparing for strikes against American fleet. A disorganized, accidental attack window resulted from communication failures and navigation errors that caused American dive bombers to arrive separately rather than as coordinated strike, but timing was perfect because Japanese carriers were maximally vulnerable with planes being rearmed and refueled on flight decks. Destroys 4 Japanese carriers through dive bomber attacks that set off catastrophic fires and explosions among armed aircraft and exposed ordnance on carrier decks, creating infernos that gutted all 4 carriers within minutes and that eliminated Japanese naval aviation striking power that had dominated Pacific since war began. Flipping entire war in Pacific through destruction of Japanese carrier force that could not be replaced quickly enough to maintain Japanese offensive momentum, Midway transformed strategic situation from Japanese dominance to rough parity that would tilt increasingly toward American advantage as American industrial production generated new carriers and aircraft faster than Japan could replace. Midway losses. The 5 minutes of American dive bomber attacks achieved what months of defensive fighting had not accomplished: permanent shift in Pacific naval balance that ended Japanese offensive capability and forced Japan into defensive posture for remainder of war. The miracle was not divine intervention but was confluence of circumstances, including Japanese tactical mistakes in leaving carriers vulnerable, American persistence despite catastrophic torpedo bomber losses, and pure luck in timing that brought dive bombers over targets at a moment when Japanese defenses were least capable of preventing attacks. Accidental victory resulted from series of American mistakes and Japanese errors that combined to create opportunity that neither side had planned or anticipated, demonstrating that warfare's outcomes sometimes depend more on chance than on superior planning or execution. Midway's significance exceeded immediate tactical victory by breaking Japanese naval superiority psychologically as well as materially, proving that Japanese forces were not invincible and that American forces could defeat them in battles where circumstances and determination compensated for Japanese advantages in experience and equipment quality. 30 Men Against Fortress was Cabanatuan prison raid in January 1945, when small team of American commandos called Alamo Scouts attempted to rescue 500 Allied prisoners of war from heavily guarded Japanese, camp deep in enemy territory on Luzon Island. They attempt rescue from camp surrounded by thousands of Japanese troops who would have annihilated rescue force if raid was detected before prisoners could be evacuated, making mission's success dependent on achieving complete surprise against guards who would execute prisoners rather than allowing their liberation. A tiny team faced impossible odds because Japanese garrison defending prison camp outnumbered raiders by factors making conventional assault suicidal, requiring unconventional approach, emphasizing stealth over firepower and speed over sustained combat, that American force could not win against Japanese defenders once element of surprise was lost. Against heavily guarded facility designed to prevent escapes, raiders needed to penetrate perimeter defenses, eliminate guards, free prisoners, and evacuate entire group before Japanese reinforcements from nearby units could arrive, and trap raiders and freed prisoners in camp or along evacuation route. The odds are suicidal when calculating probability of successfully infiltrating Japanese-controlled territory, attacking heavily defended installation, freeing hundreds of weak and sick prisoners who could not move quickly, and evacuating entire group through Japanese lines back to American territory without being intercepted by Japanese forces who would pursue once raid was detected. Fortress Prison Camp was designed to contain prisoners rather than to resist external attacks. But Japanese guards were numerous and alert enough that achieving surprise required extraordinary stealth during approach and perfectly coordinated assault that would eliminate guards before they could sound alarm or execute prisoners. Against Fortress, defended by Japanese troops whose reputation for fighting to death suggested that raid would trigger sustained combat, that American raiders lacked numbers to win through direct confrontation, making success dependent on avoiding prolonged fighting through rapid execution of plan that required splitting seconds of timing between infiltration, assault, prisoner liberation, and evacuation before Japanese reaction could prevent American withdrawal with rescued prisoners whose survival was raid's entire purpose. The perfect strike eliminated Japanese guards through coordinated assault that caught defenders completely by surprise, killing most guards before they could react effectively or execute prisoners. They were guarding as they had been ordered to do if rescue was attempted. Through stealth during approach march that brought raiders to positions surrounding prison camp without alerting Japanese patrols or camp guards, timing during assault that synchronized attacks on different guard positions, and precision in eliminating specific guards before general alarm could be raised. They eliminate guards in minutes of intense close-range combat, where American firepower advantage from automatic weapons overwhelmed Japanese defenders who could not organize coordinated resistance after initial surprise assault, disrupted their defensive positions. Free every prisoner by rapidly cutting through wire barriers and guiding confused prisoners who could barely comprehend that liberation was occurring after years of captivity, organizing evacuation that moved hundreds of weakened men across miles of enemy territory to reaching American lines before Japanese could organize pursuit. Every prisoner survived raid and evacuation, despite some being too weak to walk without assistance, requiring raiders to organize transportation and medical support during withdrawal through territory where Japanese forces could have intercepted slow-moving column of freed prisoners and exhausted raiders. The success exceeded expectations because raid's planning had anticipated every contingency from guard positions to prisoner evacuation routes, because raiders executed plan with discipline and precision under fire, and because Filipino guerrillas provided intelligence and support that made raid possible through their knowledge of Japanese dispositions and through their assistance in evacuating freed prisoners. Perfect timing between infiltration, assault, and evacuation made difference between complete success and catastrophic failure that would have resulted if any phase had been delayed or discovered prematurely. The raid demonstrated that well-planned special operations executed by highly trained soldiers could achieve objectives that seemed impossible through conventional military operations, vindicating special operations concept that small units conducting surgical strikes could accomplish missions that large formations could not achieve through direct assault, requiring sustained combat that American forces would win, but that would cost prisoner lives. That raid was designed to save through speed and surprise. Surrounded by 100,000 enemy soldiers, United States Marines defending Chosin Reservoir in November and December 1950 found themselves encircled in frozen mountains of North Korea when massive Chinese forces entered Korean War and attacked United Nations forces that had advanced toward Chinese border. Encircled in frozen mountains where temperatures reached 20 below zero Fahrenheit, Marines faced Chinese forces whose numerical superiority and willingness to accept casualties made American defensive position seem hopeless as Chinese attacks threatened to overwhelm defensive perimeter through sheer weight of numbers. By massive Chinese forces attacking from all directions simultaneously, making defensive situation more desperate through cutting American supply lines and threatening to destroy Marine Division through sustained assaults that tested defensive positions constantly. During Korean War, when Chinese intervention transformed strategic situation from United Nations, advanced toward victory into desperate retreat, fighting for survival, Marines at Chosin faced prospect of annihilation similar to what British had suffered at Singapore when Japanese forces had overwhelmed defenders through numerical superiority and aggressive tactics. United States Marines recognized they were outnumbered by ratios, making conventional defense impossible if Chinese were willing to accept casualties necessary for overwhelming American positions through sustained human wave assaults. The encirclement meant that Marines could not be reinforced or resupplied easily, except by airdrops that weather often prevented, making defensive situation increasingly desperate as ammunition and medical supplies diminished, while Chinese continued pressing attacks against defensive perimeter. Frozen mountains added environmental dangers to combat threats, as cold weather caused more casualties than Chinese attacks in some units, where inadequate cold weather equipment and brutal temperatures created frostbite epidemic among Marines whose defensive positions required remaining stationary in conditions that froze exposed flesh within minutes. Massive Chinese forces attacking Marines possessed advantages in numbers, familiarity with terrain, and willingness to accept casualties that made their eventual victory seem inevitable unless Marines could break encirclement and fight their way south to safety before Chinese attacks destroyed defensive capacity that cold and combat were diminishing daily. Fighting out while freezing to death was Marines' response to encirclement at Chosin Reservoir. Their refusal to accept defeat demonstrated through organized withdrawal, fighting through Chinese positions, rather than surrendering or being annihilated in defensive positions. They don't retreat, their commander famously declared they were attacking in different direction, transforming psychological defeat of retreat into offensive operation that maintained Marine morale and fighting spirit during withdrawal that required defeating Chinese forces blocking escape routes. Attacking in different direction meant breaking through Chinese encirclement, rather than accepting siege that would end in Marines' destruction, once ammunition was exhausted or cold had incapacitated defenders. Fighting their way out against impossible odds required maintaining unit cohesion and fighting capability during withdrawal through hostile territory, where Chinese forces attempted to block retreat routes and annihilate withdrawing Marines, through ambushes and blocking positions. Against Chinese numerical superiority that should have prevented Marines from breaking encirclement, American firepower advantages from artillery and air support when weather permitted created casualties among Chinese attackers that made their numerical advantages less decisive than they would have been in battles where Chinese could mass forces without being destroyed by American supporting fires. The withdrawal became running battle spanning 78 miles from Chosin to Hungnam, where Marines fought Chinese forces continuously while evacuating wounded and maintaining cohesion that prevented retreat from becoming rout. Freezing temperatures killed Marines through frostbite and hypothermia, even as Chinese attacks killed them through direct combat, making withdrawal race against cold as much as against enemy forces whose attacks continued throughout movement south. The Marines' survival demonstrated that disciplined withdrawal under fire was possible, even when surrounded by superior enemy forces, if troops maintained cohesion, and if supporting arms could inflict sufficient casualties on attackers to prevent them from overwhelming defensive positions. Chosin became legendary Marine Corps battle, demonstrating that determination and discipline could overcome numerical disadvantages and environmental hardships that seemed insurmountable to observers who believed Marines were doomed once. Chinese sprung their trap. A cornered army facing British elite force was Daniel Morgan's situation at Cowpens in January 1781, when his mixed continental and militia force confronted Banastra Tarleton's dragoons, who had terrorized American forces throughout southern campaigns. Morgan's force stands against feared cavalry commander, whose reputation for ruthlessness and tactical skill had made him most dangerous British officer in South. His legion of mounted troops and infantry, having defeated American forces repeatedly through aggressive tactics and superior mobility. Facing British elite that had earned reputation through victories over continental forces, Morgan's troops included unreliable militia, who typically fled when British cavalry charged, making his force qualitatively inferior despite numerical near parity that meant little when militia could not be counted on to stand against British assault. His cornered position with river at his back eliminated retreat option, forcing Morgan to fight battle he might have avoided if geography had permitted withdrawal that militia's presence would have made advisable under normal circumstances when facing British regulars and cavalry. Against Tarleton's dragoons that had shattered American formations through shock cavalry charges, breaking defensive lines before infantry could establish effective resistance, Morgan needed tactical innovation that would neutralize British cavalry advantages while exploiting American strengths in rifle marksmanship and defensive firepower. British elite force represented everything American forces feared about professional British military discipline, training, experience, and aggressive leadership that typically overwhelmed American resistance through coordinated attacks that militia could not withstand. Morgan's tactical problem was using militia effectively without expecting them to stand in prolonged firefight against British regulars, requiring plan that accounted for militia's limitations, while creating opportunities for continental regulars and cavalry to deliver decisive blows after militia had played their role. Cornered against river with nowhere to retreat, Morgan transformed geographic disadvantage into tactical advantage by eliminating militia's option to flee prematurely, forcing them to fight longer than they might have if retreat had been possible during initial British assault that Morgan anticipated would break militia's nerve despite his tactical preparations. Is less than #0. 9 is greater than the fake retreat that should have backfired was Morgan's tactical innovation, positioning militia in forward line, with instructions to fire 2 volleys then withdraw behind, continental line in controlled retreat that appeared like typical militia flight when British attacked. Morgan uses suicidal ruse based on British expectations that militia would break when charged, turning predictable militia weakness into tactical deception that lured British into pursuing what they believed was routed enemy directly into prepared continental defensive position supported by hidden cavalry. A controlled retreat executed as planned despite appearing like militia panic that British had witnessed repeatedly in previous battles. The withdrawal drew Tarleton's forces forward in pursuit that disorganized British formations and brought them into range of devastating continental volleys, delivered at close range into British troops who believed battle was already won. Should have backfired if militia retreat became actual rout rather than controlled withdrawal, if Continental line had not held against British assault, or if British cavalry had not pursued militia as Morgan predicted they would, based on Tarleton's aggressive tactical style. Turns into one of most decisive victories when Morgan's cavalry struck British flank at moment when British were fully committed to pursuing militia and engaging Continental Line, creating double envelopment that surrounded British forces and caused their collapse through combination of tactical surprise and convergent fires from multiple directions, of revolution by destroying elite British mobile force that had terrorized American forces throughout Southern Campaign. Cowpens demonstrated that tactical innovation and understanding of enemy psychology could overcome British advantages in training and experience when American commanders fought smart rather than conventionally. Morgan's victory validated unconventional tactics exploiting American advantages while accounting for American weaknesses, showing that militia could be used effectively if commanders accepted their limitations and planned accordingly rather than expecting militia to fight like Continental regulars. The fake retreat became textbook tactical maneuver, studied in military academies as example of how deception and understanding of enemy expectations could create opportunities for defeating superior forces through tactical innovation that turned enemies' aggressive instincts into liability when pursuing what appeared to be beaten enemy. Marines charging across open fields faced German defenders at Belleau Wood in June 1918 when American forces were committed to stopping German spring offensive that had pushed French forces back and threatened Paris. Forced to attack fortified German positions across terrain offering minimal cover, Marines executed assaults that exposed them to devastating machine gun fire from German defensive positions that had been prepared carefully to create interlocking fields of fire covering approaches to woods. Across Deathfield, where German machine guns created killing zones that attacking Marines had to cross under fire, casualties mounted rapidly as German defenders demonstrated effectiveness of defensive firepower against infantry attacking across open ground. Fortified German positions in Belleau Wood itself provided defenders with cover and concealment, while attackers were exposed during approach across wheat fields and through underbrush that offered inadequate protection from German fire. German machine guns, positioned in depth throughout woods, created defensive system where Marines had to fight for every position, clearing German strongpoints through frontal assaults that American tactical doctrine would normally have avoided if circumstances had permitted flanking maneuvers or artillery preparation that would reduce German defenses before infantry. Attack forced by strategic situation where American forces needed to demonstrate combat effectiveness to French allies, who doubted whether American troops could fight effectively against veteran German forces. Across open fields toward heavily defended woods where German forces held advantages of terrain and preparation, Marine attacks seemed suicidal to observers who recognized that casualties would be severe when attacking prepared positions without adequate artillery support or tactical advantages that might have compensated for German defensive superiority. The necessity of attacking despite tactical disadvantages reflected strategic imperative to halt German offensive even at severe cost, making Belleau Wood test of American combat effectiveness and determination rather than tactically sound operation that military professionals would have recommended under less urgent strategic circumstances. Retreat? Hell! Became Marine response when French forces suggested withdrawing from Belleau Wood rather than continuing attacks that were costing severe casualties without achieving rapid German evacuation. The woods are taken through relentless assaults over 3 weeks of sustained combat, where Marines fought Germans in close-quarters battles, clearing woods position by position, despite casualties that reduced some companies to fractions of their original strength. Through hand-to-hand fighting when Marines closed with German positions that machine guns and rifles defended until Marines were close enough for grenades and bayonets, combat became intensely personal in ways that open warfare rarely produced. Sheer determination to continue attacking despite casualties and despite German resistance that showed no signs of weakening until American pressure finally forced German withdrawal from positions they could no longer hold against. Sustained Marine assaults. Marines seize woods after losing over 9,000 casualties in battle that demonstrated American fighting qualities to allies and enemies alike, earning Marines' reputation for aggressive combat effectiveness that would define their identity throughout 20th century. Earn place in history as first American unit to achieve significant victory against German forces in World War I. Belleau Wood became foundational myth for Marine Corps, whose reputation was established through refusing to retreat and through willingness to accept casualties that achieving objectives required. The refusal to retreat despite tactical situation that might have justified withdrawal demonstrated American determination to fight regardless of costs, sending message to Germans that American forces would not be easily defeated, and to French that Americans possessed combat effectiveness and determination necessary for contributing meaningfully to Allied victory. Belleau Wood's significance exceeded its immediate tactical value by establishing American military reputation and by demonstrating that American forces could match European armies in combat effectiveness when properly led and when, fighting for objectives they understood, justified casualties they suffered in achieving them. 6,000 Marines versus 40,000 NVA described siege of Khe Sanh in early 1968, when isolated American base in northwestern Vietnam was surrounded by North Vietnamese forces attempting to overrun position in 2040. Battle that would demonstrate American vulnerability and boost North Vietnamese morale during Tet Offensive period. An isolated base located near Laotian border in mountainous terrain, where American forces were exposed to North Vietnamese artillery positioned in surrounding hills. Khe Sanh seemed indefensible once North Vietnamese committed forces necessary for overwhelming Marine garrison. Cut off from ground reinforcement or resupply by North Vietnamese forces blocking Route 9 connecting Khe Sanh to other American bases, Marine garrison depended entirely on air supply and air support for survival against North Vietnamese forces whose artillery could bombard base continuously while infantry prepared for final assault. Bombarded daily by North Vietnamese artillery that American counter-battery fire could not silence completely because North Vietnamese guns were positioned in caves and fortified positions in surrounding hills, Marines endured constant shelling that caused casualties and destroyed facilities, while North Vietnamese prepared for ground assault. Supposedly doomed, according to some observers who believed Khe Sanh would become American Dien Bien Phu, where French forces had been defeated through siege, culminating in final assault overwhelming exhausted defenders. An isolated base's vulnerability seemed obvious to critics, who questioned why American forces remained in exposed position that North Vietnamese could attack with superior numbers, while American advantages in mobility and firepower were negated by static defensive situation. 40,000 North Vietnamese troops surrounding Khe Sanh possessed numerical superiority that should have allowed them to overwhelm Marine garrison through sustained assaults that would eventually break through defensive perimeter once. Marines were exhausted and depleted by casualties and constant bombardment. The siege represented major North Vietnamese effort to achieve decisive victory that would demonstrate American vulnerability and that might force American withdrawal from exposed forward positions throughout northern South Vietnam, where American forces maintained bases that North Vietnamese could isolate and attack when circumstances favored offensive operations. Surviving siege required massive United States air power that delivered thousands of tons of ordnance on North Vietnamese positions surrounding Khe Sanh, disrupting North Vietnamese preparations for final assault and inflicting casualties that prevented North Vietnamese from massing forces necessary for overwhelming Marine defenses. Marine resilience sustained defensive operations for 77 days, despite constant bombardment and despite isolation that made every aspect of survival dependent on air support that weather sometimes prevented, and that North Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire contested throughout siege. Hold base through combination of defensive skill, air support that North Vietnamese could not counter effectively, and determination to resist, despite circumstances that made surrender seem rational to observers who believed position was indefensible against North Vietnamese forces committed to capturing it. For 77 days, Marines maintained defensive perimeter despite North Vietnamese probes and assaults testing American lines, despite casualties from artillery bombardment, and despite isolation that made their situation psychologically difficult, even when military situation remained manageable through air support. Breaking siege against all predictions that Khe Sanh would fall to North Vietnamese assault, Marines demonstrated that air power could sustain isolated garrison and that defensive firepower could prevent numerically superior forces from achieving breakthrough when defenders maintained cohesion and when supporting fires inflicted. Casualties, preventing attackers from massing forces for decisive assault. Against predictions from critics who believed Khe Sanh was doomed once North Vietnamese surrounded base, American forces proved that modern technology and firepower could overcome traditional siege tactics when air superiority allowed sustained supply and fire support, despite ground isolation. The siege's end came when American forces reopened Route 9 and relieved Khe Sanh garrison that had survived North Vietnamese attempt to recreate Dien Bien Phu victory, demonstrating that American forces would not be defeated through siege tactics that had worked against French forces lacking air mobility and firepower advantages that American military possessed. Khe Sanh vindicated American decision to hold exposed base by showing that air power could overcome disadvantages of static defense in exposed position, though strategic value of holding Khe Sanh remained debated long after siege ended with American survival rather than North Vietnamese victory that some had predicted was inevitable. Charging redoubts in darkness was American and French mission at Yorktown on October 14, 1781, when combined, assault forces attacked British fortified positions, defending approaches to main British defensive lines, protecting Cornwallis's army trapped on peninsula between York and James Rivers. American and French troops launched nighttime assault against fortified positions that British had constructed to delay Allied approach to main defensive works, requiring attackers to cross open ground under fire, and then assault positions defended by British regulars who would resist desperately. Against fortified British redoubts, whose defences included abattis, barriers and ditches designed to slow attackers, while defenders fired into assault columns, attempting to reach defensive works through obstacles that channeled movement and exposed attackers to concentrated defensive fire. A near-suicidal mission because nighttime assault eliminated visibility advantages while attacking fortified positions, required exposing assault forces to defensive fire during approach and during final assault across obstacles, protecting redoubts. With no margin for error because failure to capture redoubts quickly would allow British to reinforce positions and counterattack against Allied forces committed to assault, making speed essential for achieving surprise and for overwhelming defenders before they could organize effective resistance. Nighttime assault required coordination in darkness, where units could become disoriented and where friendly fire was constant danger, when visibility was minimal, and when sounds of combat made verbal communication difficult among assault forces fighting at close range. The redoubt's capture was essential for Allied siege operations because their positions prevented Allied artillery from approaching close enough to breach British main defensive lines effectively, making their elimination prerequisite for final assault that would force Cornwallis to surrender. The mission's dangers were obvious to assault forces who understood that attacking fortified positions at night guaranteed casualties and required courage exceeding what daytime assaults demanded because darkness created additional fortifa hazards while eliminating visual advantages that attackers normally enjoyed when assaulting prepared positions in daylight conditions, allowing clear observation of defensive obstacles and enemy positions. The victory that shouldn't have worked achieved rapid capture of both British redoubts through coordinated nighttime assaults that caught British defenders unprepared for aggressive American and French attacks, executed with speed and determination. Against all expectations, that nighttime assault on fortified positions would fail through coordination problems and defensive firepower breaking assault momentum, American forces under Alexander Hamilton and French forces under Wilhelm von Zweibrücken overwhelmed British defences quickly through aggressive assaults that minimized casualties by reducing time assault forces were exposed to. Defensive fire. Americans overwhelmed defences by charging through abattis barriers without pausing to clear obstacles methodically, accepting casualties from defensive fire during approach, but maintaining assault momentum that carried them over British defensive works before defenders could concentrate fire effectively. Sealing Cornwallis's fate by eliminating last significant British defensive positions outside main British lines, Redoubt's capture allowed Allied artillery to position close enough for breaching British fortifications and for making British position untenable through sustained bombardment that Cornwallis could not counter effectively. Ending revolution through forcing Cornwallis's surrender when siege operations made British position hopeless after Redoubt's loss eliminated buffer zone, protecting main British defensive lines from Allied artillery that could now breach fortifications systematically. The nighttime assault's success demonstrated that aggressive tactics executed rapidly could overcome defensive advantages that fortifications provided when defenders were not prepared for nighttime assault speed and when attackers accepted casualties necessary for maintaining momentum through defensive obstacles. Against expectations that assault would fail or would cost prohibitive casualties, American and French forces captured redoubts with surprisingly light losses by attacking aggressively without pausing for methodical obstacle clearance that would have exposed them to prolonged defensive fire. The victory vindicated decision to assault fortified positions at night despite risks, demonstrating that surprise and speed could overcome defensive firepower advantages when attackers executed plans with discipline and determination that British defenders could not match when surprised by assault's intensity and rapidity in capturing positions they believed they could hold against any attack. The pattern of impossible emerges clearly when examining American military history's most unlikely victories. They resulted not from material superiority that Americans often lacked when facing enemies, but from audacity to attempt operations that seemed impossible, adaptation to circumstances that made conventional tactics ineffective, sacrifice that soldiers accepted when achieving objectives required extreme casualties, and refusal to die quietly when surrounded or outnumbered by forces that expected American surrender or collapse. Americans have survived impossible situations through combination of factors that transcended simple military superiority, demonstrating that determination and tactical innovation could overcome disadvantages in numbers, training, or equipment, when commanders fought intelligently and when soldiers maintained cohesion despite circumstances justifying surrender or retreat, not through superiority that Americans possessed only occasionally when facing British, Germans, Japanese, Chinese, or North Vietnamese forces, whose professional capabilities often exceeded American advantages, making American victories achievements of spirit and adaptation rather than inevitable results of material predominance. The nation's story is built not on easy wins that confirmed American superiority, but on impossible victories that demonstrated American capacity to achieve objectives despite facing enemies who should have won through conventional military calculations. These battles reveal a pattern where Americans succeeded through refusing to accept defeat that circumstances seemed to dictate, through adapting tactics to situations where conventional approaches would fail, through accepting casualties that objectives justified, and through maintaining cohesion when less determined forces would have collapsed under pressures that American forces somehow withstood. On impossible victories rather than on easy triumphs, American military tradition was forged through battles where survival seemed unlikely and victory seemed impossible until Americans proved that determination and innovation could overcome material disadvantages when soldiers refused to surrender despite hopeless circumstances. The pattern continues through American military history, from Revolution through World Wars to Korea and Vietnam, showing that American forces consistently achieved impossible victories, not because they were inherently superior, but because they possessed audacity to attempt what seemed impossible, adaptability to make it work, and refusal to accept defeat that circumstances appeared to guarantee. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.